And so, where are we at in the story of Joseph?
Israel is near death.
That's right. Israel / Jacob is near death, right? He's in Egypt with his sons now. The sons had come down initially for food, and now the last few weeks we've been looking at them, and they eventually come down to Egypt. They stayed there for quite some time, and now Jacob in Israel is on his deathbed. And what did he do last week in our study?
Bless the sons.
That's right. He blessed the sons, right? He blessed his 12 sons, and he also blessed 2 other people. Who were they? Joseph's sons, right? Ephraim and Manasseh, who become 2 of the larger and more influential nation, or tribes, if you will, in the nation of Israel. And so now we're going to see Jacob's going to die. And of course, as you can tell by the introduction slide, Jacob and Joseph are both going to die in the last chapter in 5 verses of the book of Genesis. And let's just jump right in and let's read verses 28 through 33 of our text. Chapter 49, verses 28 through 33. All these, the 12 tribes of Israel, that is what their father said to them, and he blessed him, blessing each with the blessing suitable to him. Then he commanded them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, and the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, the land of Canaan, which Abraham brought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. They buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is in it were bought from the Hittites. And when Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. And so here we see Jacob gives his burial orders. And where does he tell his sons that he wants to be buried? He wants to be buried in Canaan, right? And we're at in Canaan. And the family cave, right? The family cave called Machpelah. And he bought this cave from Ephron, who was a what? A Hittite, right? And so before the time of the Israelites, during this time frame, the Hittites were one of the leading powers of the Mediterranean world. Here you have the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hittites, and the Egyptians are the 4 main powers in this part of the world from about the 23rd century BC, and then the Hittites are going to kind of dissipate, if you will, probably around 15 BC or 15th century BC or a little bit earlier. And so he goes here, the Hittites from the land of Canaan. Historically, we know that's true. For a long time, people thought, the Bible talks a lot about Hittites. There's been no archaeological evidence of anything that we can find of this Hittite civilization. But for the last couple hundred years, we now know that the Hittite civilization was very powerful. In fact, we believe they were the first ones to have iron chariots and iron weapons. And so, once again, the Bible was validated through archaeology that came only in the last couple hundred years. But he buys this in Machpelah, and there's a connection that's there, right? What's the family connection to this cave? Yeah, first you've got Abraham and Sarah, right? And these are the foundations of the patriarch. Abraham is the one who was called by God to leave his father and his household. One of the things we saw back in Genesis chapter 12 that really put us on the journey for the rest of the trajectory of the book of Genesis. And so he leaves his father's house, and then him and his wife die, and of course they're buried in Machpelah. And who else is buried there?
Rebecca.
All right, Rebecca and Isaac. All right, so Isaac and Rebecca are buried there, that next generation. And now one of the interesting things here, who else is going to be buried here? It's going to be Jacob and Rachel, right? Because Rachel's the wife that he loved and he worked 14 years for, correct? No. Who's the wife that's going to be buried there? Leah, which is interesting, right? Because she really wasn't his favorite wife. At least the text tells us that he loved Rachel more than Leah. Now, we don't know, where was Rachel buried? Anybody remember? It's near Bethlehem, right? It's on the road to Bethlehem, as the Bible tells us. Now, how close to Bethlehem is up for debate. Some would say it's in Bethlehem, and some would put it as much as 13 miles outside of Bethlehem, but we're just told that it's on the road to Bethlehem. And so we're not told how much longer Leah lives after Rachel, because honestly, the text just never mentions it again. So we don't know how soon she died after her sister. We don't know how old she was when she died. In fact, the rest of the women of Jacob's life are never really mentioned again after the death of Rachel and with Reuben's sin. And so they kind of just fizzle out of the picture. And so we don't know when she died, but it is interesting that Jacob's resting place in the family cave of the patriarchs is actually going to be with not Rachel, but with Leah. And obviously, out of his 4 baby mamas, right? If we're going to talk in colloquial English, right? New English version. Which one had the most kids? Leah, right? Is that why she gets in? I have no idea. But it is interesting when you think about one of 4 women getting in. Of course, it's Leah, the one he marries first. In the ancient world, the first wife always had prestige. And so he actually married Leah first, even though he thought he was marrying Rachel. And so maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's because she had more sons. Maybe it's because she lived after Rachel. We're just not told, but it is quite interesting.
You think it may have been for convenience?
Maybe so. One of the interesting things to me is that Jacob tells him to bury him in the family cave. And if you look, it's at least 200 miles, maybe more, from Egypt, where they're at in Goshen, to the family cave. He tells his sons to travel him there. Now, he's the patriarch. Maybe it's more importance than Rachel. But if you look to see how far away the cave of Mamre was, Machpelah and Bethlehem, on the road to Bethlehem, it's not super far away. And so one of the things I've always wondered is, why not just bury Rachel there? Why not just, go to the cave?
Do they put those, like the bones in boxes like you thought at this time, or do they do it later on?
Yeah, the ossuary box. It's a great question. I would say most likely it's the same practice. If Ken's talking about the practice in most family tombs, what they would do is they would leave the body in the tomb. They would oftentimes come back later when the body had decomposed. They would take that body, take the bones, and then put it into a smaller box, and that is called an ossuary box.
So they keep them in the cave, then, in that cave?
Yeah, they would keep the bones in that cave, in the ossuary box. And so the multiple generations would be in that same cave. But obviously, if the bones are kind of laid out, it takes up more room than if you put it in the bones in a smaller box. And so, yeah, he's put into his bones are preserved, right, to the time where he's going to be going to Egypt a couple hundred years later. And so, good. Todd?
Would it be that the reason why he didn't put Rachel in Machpelah was because Isaac was still alive at that time when she died?
Maybe so.
Or maybe one of those things where he felt like he couldn't bury her before.
It's a good question. Like Todd is saying, the genealogies and the timelines and the ages is something I want us to talk about in just a second with the sons. But, could it have been that maybe Isaac had not died yet, and so that's why Rachel's not in there? And the only issue that somebody could say is, well, we don't know when Leah died, and so maybe she died before Isaac too, which, again, we don't know because it doesn't mention us. But it is a theory that is plausible, right? I think about Mythbusters, right? You've got the ones that are like confirmed, denied, or plausible. It's very plausible. I just don't know if that's the reason why or not, but certainly could be. Anyone else? All right. There's also another connection that is here. We're talking about the family connection, but there's also another connection that's here that's very important. In fact, Joseph even strengthens this with his command to take his bones back to Egypt. Abraham buys the field from the Hittites because he is going to own land, stake a claim in Canaan. This is their land. And so even though they're sojourning in Egypt, home, the real connection towards back home is in Canaan, right? That's why Jacob says, you bury me back home. Home's in Canaan. That's why Joseph says, take my bones back home. homes in Canaan. And so this idea that as the Israelites are listening to the Genesis being read to them by Moses for the first time, there's this strong connection with Canaan. Your ancestors lived there. They were buried there. We're going there. It's yours. And so when we get there, you fight, you take it because it's rightfully yours. God's given it to you. And so you also had that connection between the land and them, and that it's theirs for their possession. It's where their forefathers are buried. Most of you probably can't tell me where your great-great-grandparents are buried. Because in our culture, it's not a big deal. It doesn't really mean a lot in our culture. Now, maybe you can, and maybe that is important to you. But by and large, most people can't tell you where their great-grandparents are buried, and they don't really care a whole lot because that's not something our culture values. In the ancient world, what happened to your body when you died and where your bones were buried was very important. And so there's that connection there also. All right? Jacob dies at the age of 147, the text tells us. And so he had 11 sons. The 11 sons range in age from 56 to 63. So Reuben is the oldest son. Reuben is 63 years old when his father dies. Joseph is the 11th son. He is 56. The interesting thing is there are 7 years between Reuben and Joseph and 7 years between Joseph and Benjamin. So who's the one that's 49? Who's that? Benjamin, right? And so there you can kind of see the spread of the brothers, the age of when they lose their father. Also, we'll revisit the ages in just a second. But he mentions here in verse 33 that he was gathered to his people. Oftentimes people will tell you that in the Old Testament, the Hebrews or the Israelites did not have a fully formed idea of the afterlife. Now, whether that's true or not can be debated. In fact, I think verses like verse 33 are interesting enough to debate. Verse 33, that he was gathered to his fathers. Now, we know that that's not talking about his burial per se because his burial was going to come later. Someone would say, well, maybe this is a heading and then we're going to focus in on what takes place with the burial itself. Maybe so. But even you have passages like with David in 1 Samuel chapter, I believe it's 12, where Nathan goes to him and says, your son is dead. Or the servant say, your son is dead. And he says, he can't come to me, but I can go to him. Right? This idea of the connection of the afterlife and Sheol, even people can see each other and know each other. And so just kind of interesting that it might be an insight to the afterlife in the Old Testament. Any questions or comments on that?
It did kind of seem the good and bad both in the same place.
Yeah.
Samuel being brought back
The witch at Endor? Yeah. Yeah. It is interesting. And it's kind of interesting later on you see the Pharisees, right? That's one of the reasons how the Pharisees and Paul differed. The Pharisees believed the resurrection was only for the righteous, right? But the rabbinical Jewish or the Orthodox Jewish today would say that everybody's going to take part in the Sheol resurrection. Just like how, of course, Christians would believe that everybody will be resurrected. Of course, some to life and some to death. And so, good.
God introduces himself really after this as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Jesus used that to tell the Pharisees that God's not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. Because people are to follow after God, and he introduced himself as the God of their ancestors. And so, to show that they're still alive.
Yeah.
They're not the state you're in, but they're still alive.
I think it's right. I think one of the interesting things is that Moses is supposed to go there and tell them, right, that he's coming in the name of Yahweh, the God of, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then what does he do when he gets there? He gives them through inspiration the book of Genesis, which is the what? The story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? And so it's just kind of interesting, like what you were saying, Todd. You made me think about that for a second. All right? Good. All right, let's move on. Let's read verses 1 through 14 of our text of chapter 50, the last chapter of Genesis. Then Joseph fell on his face and wept and kissed his father. And Joseph commanded his servants and physicians to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it. That is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. And when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, I'm about to die, and my tomb I have hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan. There shall you bury me. Now therefore let me go, please, up to my father, and bury my father, as he made you swear. So Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was very great company. And when they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which had been beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with very great and grievous lamentation. And he made a mourning for his father 7 days. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, This is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians. Therefore the place was named Abel Mizraim. It is beyond the Jordan, and thus the sons did for him as he commanded them. For the sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with a field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. And so verses 1 through 14 give us some interesting details about what takes place after Jacob dies. And that is, he is what? He's embalmed, right? And it takes 40 days. And what they do, they would cut open the body. They would take out the organs. They would then like pump spices and stuff into the body. They would then sew it back up. The body would dry out. They would wrap it up. Of course, you probably know how mummies from middle school science and history. The interesting thing here is that it mentions how many days did one of the things, embalming was actually extremely expensive. And so there were different types of embalming. Now, what we know from Joseph's status and their wealth, Jacob probably got the top of the line, right? I mean, he got the best of the best. And so, but how long do they mourn for Jacob? 70 days. The interesting thing that we're told from history, like Diodorus, who was a Greek historian, says that they mourn 72 days for the Pharaoh. And that's the most they ever mourn for anybody. And so them mourning 70 days for Jacob is an extremely, extremely high honor. Now, we don't know how many days are appropriate for mourning based upon people's different political importance or their wealth. But whenever you're an Israelite leaving Egypt, you know that they mourn 72 days for the Pharaoh because in the Egyptian eyes, he's God on earth. And so to think that your ancestor was mourned by Pharaoh and his household for 70 days, that's the type of importance and status that God had placed on the shoulders of Jacob and Joseph as they were in the land of Egypt. And so it would have been very important for them to do this. The interesting thing is the embalming process is 40 days, and the typical Hebrew mourning was 30 days. Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 8 tells us that was typically the amount of time they would mourn. And so together you have 70 days of mourning. And it's an incredible funeral procession. We still have funeral processions even today. The more people in the procession perceive, more people the person touched, the more hoopla, I guess if you will, over the funeral procession, the more importance that person was culturally or politically, right? When my grandmother passes away this week, she's not going to be on C-SPAN or CNN. But the next time a president passes away, they're going to be on CNN, Fox News, and C-SPAN. That's just how it works, right? So the more impact you make on society or culture as a whole, the more people stop and the more hoopla is made. And so same thing with Jacob. And so the Canaanites are watching. And the more interesting thing on a map, if you see this, they don't go straight up to Machpelah. They kind of go around, and it's a foreshadowing of the route that Moses is actually going to take whenever they go into the Promised Land, as they kind of wrap around and then go through Jordan, coming from the east to the west, instead of just going straight up through the Negev up into where Mamre is. And so, but who goes with them on this funeral procession?
All of Pharaoh's sons.
Yeah, if you take all of somebody's servants, does that disrupt their life a little bit? I don't have servants, but if I did, I feel like I'd have to make my own bread and toast and, stuff like that. So I feel like it would be a big change for me, at least for a few days. And all the servants of Pharaoh go, and all the elders of Pharaoh's house, and all the elders of what? Egypt. If you take away all the leaders from a place for about 3 weeks, the amount of time it would have taken to get up with chariots up to Mamre, back in 7 days of mourning, do you think the entire nation gets thrown off a little bit? Yeah. All your leaders, right? And this is a time of where the leaders are the leading class. They're the aristocrats of Egyptian society, are gone for 3 weeks. The people in the nation take notice, and so the entire nation stops in a way, and lives are changed because of the death of Jacob, which is interesting because God told Abraham that he was going to bless him and his descendants, and that he was going to exalt his name throughout the earth. Now, of course, we know the fulfillment of that is through who? Jesus, right? But we do see that in a somewhat initial fulfillment through Abraham's physical offspring, with Isaac and his status, with Abimelech and in Canaan, with Jacob and Joseph in Egypt, and of course Moses in Egypt and also in the land of Canaan. And so the Canaanites are amazed that all these things are taking place, that literally the most powerful nation on earth stops for over 2 months to mourn the death of this foreigner that had only lived in their country for how many years? For 17 years, right? And so, interesting. This is a picture of a skeleton, of the skeletal remains of someone who had been mummified, and this is their outer casket, if you will. This dates back close to the time of Joseph. And so what you're seeing is an aristocrat in Egypt around the same time as the story of Joseph. And so likely this would have been something similar to what Jacob would have received, potentially. Don't know for sure, of course, because obviously 3,000 years ago, but it's kind of neat to see something like that and tie it to the biblical story. Any questions on verses 1 through 14 or comments? Yes, Jim?
I guess the Egyptians did the embalming, right?
They did. Here it says it was Joseph's physicians. And so normally the embalming process would have been done by priests. Now, because they were done by priests, this was done as a very religious act. In fact, the organs were taken out of the body, and the four, except the heart was left in. But the four essential organs, like the lungs, the kidneys, and stomach, and something else, there was four they would preserve. They would put in pots. The tops of those pots were heads, and those heads were to Egyptian gods. And so many have said, whoa, if Jacob was embalmed by the Egyptians, and that means that it was a religious practice. But the Bible doesn't say that the priests are the ones that did Jacob's embalming. It's actually a very important note that is there in that text, that we're told that it wasn't the Egyptian priest, but it was actually the physicians of Joseph. And so, it's good question. Comment. Anyone else? I can see some of you have comments on your face, but you just don't want to say it. We're all friends here. Like you can say what you like. No?
Jacob, they were worse than God, right? The whole group.
They were. Earlier in their life, it's not very impressive, especially some of the stories that we get with the brothers, even Judah a little bit later in his life. But we're going to see in our next few verses that it does seem like the entire family had finally gotten on the same page religiously and were worshipers of God. Good. All right. Well, let's go ahead and let's read verses 15 through 21. When Joseph's brothers saw their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of God, of your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. And his brothers came and fell down before him and said, Behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to him, Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to him. And so here the brothers send a message. Now who do the brothers say the message comes from? Their father. And so does the text tell us that's where it came from? No. Does the text tell us that it's not where it came from? Not explicitly. So let's take a vote, right? And so if you think that Jacob said this to his sons before his death, raise your hand. You guys aren't giving me for that, are you? If you think that the brothers conspired and made this story up to get on Joseph's good side because they were afraid, raise your hand. All right, definitely kind of how it reads, right? And even if it doesn't explicitly say that, it kind of seems like it's the way it's kind of leaning. And so it seems like this wasn't a message from their father. But is it a good message? I mean, they use 3 words about their action. What are the 3 words they use? Sin, evil, transgression, right? And so they're owning up to the idea that they're not making excuses for themselves. They said, look, what we did, we transgressed against you. It was evil. It was sin. And so they're fully owning it. And they also said that we're now servants of God. So back to what Ken had said, early in their life, they were not very godly people. But now, and we have no reason to doubt, because it seems that they've been doing pretty good for a while, that they are now servants of God. And not only are they servants of God, who do they say they're going to be servants of? Joseph. Do you hear the irony there? Who sold Joseph into servitude or slavery? His brothers, right? And now all those brothers together are bowing down at his feet saying, we are your servants, right? Because they know if Joseph wants them dead, he can kill them any moment he wants to. There'll be no judge. There'll be no public outcry. There'll be no social media response. I mean, none of that stuff. He does it anytime he feels like it. And so the brothers are genuinely afraid. How long have they been in Egypt since they've known that Joseph is Joseph? 17 years.
Still scared that he's going to kill them.
Yeah. So in 17 years, right, have they been reassured of their standing before Joseph? Not till now, right? And so they're still afraid. They've been there 17 years.
Still can't sleep at night.
Yeah, and they're still afraid, right? They're still afraid, waiting for the Egyptian guards to come in at any moment and round them up now that Dad is dead, right? Joseph, the only reason he didn't do it is because of his love for Dad, not because of his love for us. Now Dad's gone. What are we going to do, right? And so, and here you can see that Joseph, whenever he hears the message, what does he do? He weeps, right? This is not the first time that Joseph has cried. Not the first time that Joseph has cried in response to seeing his brothers. And so Joseph seems to be someone who, even though the brothers thought that maybe it wasn't genuine, it seems that Joseph genuinely in his heart forgave his brothers, even when they came the first 2 times. You can see that the forgiveness had already been working on the heart and mind of Joseph. And so the interesting thing here, the quote, "Am I in the place of God?" His dad said those exact same words in Genesis 30, verse 2. Jacob did. Now, why did Jacob say those words? Do you remember the story? What took place?
Is that where he was taking sheep from heaven?
No. Alvin had it right. Rachel wasn't having any kids, and Rachel said, give me a son or a child or I'll die. Right? And Jacob says, am I in the place of God? Right? And so basically saying that's not, it's not for me to decide, right? That's up to us in God's hands. And so Joseph did not see himself as the wielder of the Lord's righteous sword, he saw himself as a servant, and he saw himself as someone who was trying to provide for his family. I think about the New Testament verse, which is actually a quotation from the Old Testament, Romans chapter 12, verse 19. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, thus saith the Lord. And so if Joseph really wanted to, he could have had vengeance for himself, and in the eyes of many have been justified, right? God has blessed me. God has shown that he has given me wise and good judgment, and I don't like you, so I'm going to take care of you, right? But Joseph didn't see himself as a punisher, right? He saw himself as a protector. He could look back and say, you know what? You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, right? And so because he had a heart of forgiveness, he could see that. Brother Ricky?
Don't you imagine his brothers also bowing down to him just to for themselves? I mean, obviously they had become pretty comfortable in Goshen.
Yeah.
They certainly did not want to lose the prestige that they had by being Joseph's brother. And they certainly didn't want to go back to Canaan. So I think it was somewhat self-serving on their part to bow down to him as well, to make sure they held on to what they had.
Yeah. Miss Brenda.
Do you think that they thought back at the dreams that he had way back when he was a child? You know, that
Yeah.
this is the ultimate ending of that dream.
Yeah. It's they bow down to him when they first come, right? But I do think this is because I mean, we're the last chapter of the book. This is the climax of the story of Joseph and of Genesis itself. And so I do think that that's certainly in the inspired author's mind as they bow down and worship him, or bow down and claim to be their servants. It could be, there could be, and as Ricky was saying, there could be a source of self-preservation. Well, there's obviously a sense of self-preservation of their lives, but maybe like you're saying, of their livelihood, of their spiritual standing. I would like to give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt and think they really are genuinely, because they use the word transgression, sin, and evil, they realize that it's wrong, that, that they need to make amends to Joseph. And so, I don't know. Is there a part of selfish motivation that is there? Maybe a little bit. It's hard for any of us to completely divorce ourselves away from personal motives in any situation, right? But yeah, it certainly could be a part of that lavish lifestyle they've been grown accustomed to over the last 17 years. Certainly slavery would look a lot differently than what being leaders and heads of households in Goshen. And so Joseph weeps. They had been there 17 years, and Joseph had showed them kindness, and yet they were still afraid of vengeance. It had been 40 years since the actual act had been done. And so it had been 40 years since they had sold their brother into slavery and had done this thing to them, and they still had fear and shame. I think that's important for us to talk about just for a second, because oftentimes when we do things that are wrong, the fear and shame never really goes away, which is why it's so important to decide not to do those things, right? There's a quote that I like that's very deep and profound. It says, everything happens for a reason. Sometimes the reason is you're stupid, right? And I can say that because I've lived that. Like I've done it myself several times. And so, and I'm sure many of you have done the same thing. And so, and God can forgive us, and people can forgive us, but oftentimes, who's the hardest person to get forgiveness from? Ourselves, right? And that sense of guilt and shame that you see gnawing at these brothers 40 years later, most of us, if not all of us, have a little bit of that in our life. I mean, I think I do. I know I do, right?
It's sin, actually.
Yeah, because we, like you were saying, it's sin, right? And the best way not to have that guilt and shame is just to make up your mind beforehand, I'm not going to do anything that's going to bring guilt or shame upon myself, upon Christ, upon the church, a family. And so to go ahead and make that decision now, so you don't have to try to make amends and live with yourself and look at that person in the mirror and feel that sense of guilt and shame. And so sometimes it's better to make those decisions to not do something than it is to look retrospectively and still carry that guilt and that shame with us. Yes. Todd?
The first time the brothers actually admitted doing something wrong.
Yeah.
Even when they told Jacob that Joseph was alive, they never told Jacob, oh, by the way, we lied to you.
Yeah.
So this is the first time they own that. They basically, even though they said it was under the words of Jacob, they actually owned up to the fact we did something wrong.
Yeah, they're confessing their faults to Jacob, right? I mean, to Joseph. And so you're right. I mean, you see that sense of confession and here and kind of like with our own sins, right? Even though we still may feel that sense of guilt and shame, so the Bible says, confess your sins one to another and pray for each other that you may be healed, right? And so there's this power. I know, not a Christian, but Terry Crews. You know who Terry Crews is?
Yes.
You know, a very big comedian. It's a massive guy. It's massive. Anyways, he came out a couple years ago with an addiction to pornography. And he talked about that. Many people there's a lot of supporters, but a lot of people are like, why would you say that? Why would you be that open about yourself in public? And he said, you can only live with shame for so long. The only way to get rid of shame is to let people know. You know, it's just to get it out and say, you know, I struggle with this. I need help. And so, in a way, just like these brothers were confessing themselves to Joseph, getting that out in the air so they get past that guilt and shame, the Bible tells us in the New Testament that's exactly what we're supposed to do. Confess our sins one to another and pray for each other, right? And so, but we live in a culture where we don't like to share shameful things, and so oftentimes we don't confess and we don't find the healing that we need. God meant it for good. This is the climax of the story of Joseph and also of Genesis. But it's also, could be said, this is the precursor of Christ, right? Those that crucify the Lord meant it for evil, and yet God meant it for good, that many people could be alive, might be saved, just like the words that Joseph used here. You can even say it in our own lives. This is still the case today. Oftentimes we look back in our lives and see hardships, things we had to go through, and realize that if it wasn't for those things, maybe we wouldn't be in this spot in life. Maybe we wouldn't be have relationships that we have. Maybe we wouldn't be the Christian that we are today had we not had those hardships. For time's sake, let's go ahead and let's move on to verses 22 through 26. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house, and Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. The children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will lead you to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you will carry up my bones from here. And so Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him and put him in a coffin in Egypt. And so one of the things that's interesting here in verses 22 through 26 is he dies at 110. In Egyptian folklore, this is the perfect age. Even though from archaeology, most people died in Egypt between the ages of 40 and 50. The United States, life expectancy is above 80 if you take out child mortality. And so very, in the 80s, very blessed time to live. But he's 110. One of the really cool things, looking retrospectively, that I thought about a lot this past week, is the difference in the brothers' ages. Okay? There's 7 years between Reuben and Joseph. Think about that just for a second. The first 11 sons are born in less than 7 years. Now, how is that possible? They get 4 wives, it makes it a little bit easier, right? But think about that. There's in 7 years, 11 sons. Then there's 7 years from Joseph to Benjamin. So we're told Joseph's age when he goes out to check up on his brothers, right? And they're going to kill him. Then they're going to put him in the pit. Then they sell him into slavery. How old are these brothers? Reuben's the oldest one. How old at the most can he be? 24, right? And so at the most, he's 24 years old. He's the oldest. We don't think about it. A lot of times when I read that story, I don't think about that, right? They all range from 24 to 17 as they betray their brother and sell him into slavery. Anybody done any dumb stuff when you were in your late teens, early 20s? I won't ask for a show of hands, right? You probably didn't sell your brother into slavery, though. But a lot of times when we read the story of Joseph being sold into slavery, what do we think of his brothers as? Older. Grown men, right? So Think about the oldest one being 24 to 17, and of course Benjamin is only 10 when his brother is sold into slavery. And so just kind of, I think it gives the story of Joseph maybe a little bit more interesting dynamic. We'll look at the ages. Yes, Brother Lane.
Did Joseph outlive his brother?
It's a great question, and the answer is yes, but we don't know how many. Because it says Joseph said to his brothers. Now, if Joseph is 110, that means Benjamin is 103, right? He's the youngest one. So they all make it past 100. And obviously, if Joseph is number 11, he speaks to his brothers, you think there's at least maybe one or more living, which would be, at the most, they're 7 years above. So that at the most, it's 117. Now, that doesn't seem too unlikely, because if Joseph can live to 110, the oldest brother he has is only 7 years older than he is. Now, who those brothers are, we don't know. The text doesn't tell us. But it seems like at least two. What's that?
Two of his sons were his brothers.
Yes. Now, would they be counted as brothers here? Maybe. It's a good question. It's a good question that I can't give the answer on. But it's plausible, as we said with Todd earlier. And, but maybe those are the youngest ones, right? And so he foretells the deliverance and the burial. And so as the children of Israel are hearing this, they know that they're the ones who have been given the privilege of taking his body back to the land of Canaan. Once again, so sorry for time. Our takeaways, the age difference in Jacob's sons, I really think it's very important, and also changes how we read the text and the story of Joseph when we think about how old they are at each interval of where they interact. When Joseph is in his 30s as appointed the leader, and they come down for food, his brothers are, late 30s, early 40s. Guilt and shame lasts a long time, so be sure you don't do anything that brings you guilt and shame. Right, go ahead and make that decision now, what you will and will not do as a Christian. It'll save you a lot of guilt and shame moving forward. Number 3, God meant it for good. And so this helps us to live our life through hardships. If we remember that God is in control, even when we face hardships, we face whatever hardship you want to throw in for time's sake, throw it in there. If we know that God is in control, if we believe Romans 8:28, that God's not going to put anything on us that we can't handle, that He loves us, we can live life with that understanding. Now, why would this have been important to the original audience, the Israelites? That's right. Exactly. He's telling his descendants that you're about to go to slavery. And then for the original audience, right, the Israelites coming out of slavery, what does that tell them? God never abandoned you. He was with you the whole time. That's why you're leaving the most wealthy land in the world with all their stuff. That never would have happened if you wouldn't have been slaves in Egypt in the best part of the land. And so God meant it for good. In retrospect, we can see that. The struggle as Christians is to see that in that moment. And so thank you so much for a good class. I'm looking forward to next week. Brother Ed?
Isaac, how many years is it from this time to the Exodus?
Roughly 400. And so the Bible gives us a rough estimate of about 400 years. So, good question.
God told Abraham that the descendants would be 400 years.
He did.
So did that carry on down? I mean, did he mention that carried on down by word of mouth?
I don't know. We're not told expressly that's what happened. It may have been passed down. It may not have been. So it's a good question. Just don't know for certain. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for letting us go a little bit later. And so I blame Peyton. He didn't start announcements till 8 after 7. And so we'll have a talk with him. So, which really, if you go by that number, we're getting out 5 minutes early, guys, right? And so anyways, let's go ahead and let's pray. Thank you so much. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this opportunity to come together and to study your word. We're so thankful that even in the hardships of our life that we can look to you and realize that you love us, that you're in control, and that all things are working together to good for those who love the Lord. And dear Heavenly Father, please give us the ability and the strength to make decisions, to have resolve in the face of sin and temptation, so that we can be strong and not have to bear the guilt and shame of past decisions and mistakes later in life. And dear Heavenly Father, if we do have those types of emotions of guilt and shame, help us to have the courage to confess those things to each other, to pray for one another, that we might be healed. And we're so thankful for the forgiveness and grace that we have through your Son. And it's in His name we pray. Amen.